If you can follow this one rule, you'll probably decrease your emotional reactivity by half. And this rule isn't about willpower, it isn't something that takes a lot of energy or effort. It's a rule about being really honest with yourself. When it comes to emotional reactivity, our emotions are the match, the origin source of ignition. Our habits and our self-care and our problem-solving skills might be the wood or what maintains the fire. And how we think is like gasoline. And there's a certain type of thinking that's especially volatile, and that's what we call black and white thinking. Now, black and white thinking is when you take a situation and you think of it in an extreme way. You push out all of the nuance and you turn it into something as intense as possible, and you usually recognize it when you can use words like always, never, perfect, terrible, or like everything, everyone, nothing, nobody, worst or best. These are called horribilizations, where you take something horrible and you horribilize it. Now notice how in these situations, black and white thinking inflates the situation. So for example, husband says to his wife, I always gotta do the dishes, I always gotta clean up after you. Or a depressed, edgy young adult who says, everything is cringe, every girl or boy is toxic, I'll never be able to succeed. Or it could be at work, right? Like, my boss is a terrible communicator. You see, each time a person is in a bad situation, they make it worse by hyperbolizing it. Never, always, everything, hopeless, terrible. So the more extreme your thinking, the more intense your emotions will be, and the more likely you are to be depressed and anxious. But black and white thinking also makes you feel hopeless and leads you to feel more depressed and anxious. But you know what though? It's a big, fat, filthy franken lie. When you use black and white thinking, you're distorting a nuanced reality by ignoring the bad and hyperbolizing the good, or vice versa. You're lying, and even worse, it's to yourself. So if it's not living Moss, why do we do it? It's because you domesticated your brain to like black and white thinking because it serves a purpose in the short term. So what sort of purpose does it serve? Well, it justifies you. So if your wife does the dishes sometimes, but not always, why would you want to frame it in the worst possible light, you monster? My wife never does the dishes. The reason you want to phrase it that way is because it makes you feel like the good guy and puts her down. You're making yourself feel better while in the long run making the situation worse. If your boss has some skill or strength or talent but struggles to communicate, why would you want to say they're awful in every way? Because then you don't have to put in the effort to be assertive and talk about your needs and listen to theirs. Believing your boss is the worst is a mental habit to excuse yourself from the work. Why would you lie to make a sincerely difficult situation harder? Because then you excuse yourself from trying to put in an effort from the difficulty and the hours of research or the painful feeling of failure. Black and white thinking is an old habit that safeguards you from the painful feeling of disappointment. When we exaggerate how bad things are, it excuses us from action. It creates the idea that we're helpless little babies and therefore we don't need to do anything. It helps us feel powerless and thereby shields us from feeling guilty or accountable, so be honest with yourself as much as possible. Like it feels good to call your friend and tell them you've had the worst day in the entire universe. And of course they say things like, oh, you poor baby. But the thing is, most of the time we don't even make that call. We just have that internal dialogue with ourselves and tell ourselves that. Like we kind of like the vindication. It feels good. Now there's a reason that your brain plays this sort of trickery on you, and it's connected to your fight or flight freeze response. Let's say our ancestors were at war with another tribe. The fight or flight freeze response shuts down the nuance options in the brain. We see the attacking tribe as subhuman, trash, just awful, the embodiments of evil. Black and white thinking makes it easier to fight back because you don't see yourself in that enemy. You only see them as the bad guy. In life-endangering situations, black and white thinking might help us make quick and decisive decisions. Simplicity is easier than thinking about all the nuanced complexities in between reality that could potentially help us survive. But since the majority of situations in modern society aren't that way, black and white thinking gets in the way of our emotional stability the rest of the time. So if we want to be less emotionally reactive, we need to replace black and white thinking with something more productive. What do we do about it? The first rule is honesty. You gotta remind yourself that black and white thinking is a lie you tell yourself to excuse yourself from something. If you're willing to be honest with yourself, then it's time for the next step. Notice when you're doing it. Notice what triggers you. 99% of the time, words like always and never aren't accurate. And that includes other words you use to justify yourself. You just gotta catch yourself doing it. Make a list and put it somewhere you can see it of all the warning signs and words that you're slipping back into black and white thinking. Take a deep breath, relax, slow yourself down, Buster Brown. Next, name an emotion. And the emotion might be real, but the thoughts aren't. Say things like, I feel angry, instead of things like, I feel like you're making me angry. I feel like you never take out the trash. Those are lies and also thoughts, not feelings. They're lies because they're exaggerated, but that's not a real feeling statement. 3 words only. I feel emotion. Next, reframe the situation. Speak in the gray. There might be a real problem that needs solving, and the emotion can motivate you to take action, but the extreme thinking will impact your ability to solve the problem the right way, so try to look in the gray. Use both or and instead of extreme thinking. Now, this is a therapy tactic that seems annoying, but is actually really helpful because you can feel 2 emotions at the same time, right? Like you can have 2 nuanced truths that may seem contradictory at the same time. For example, when your boss miscommunicates a deadline to you, instead of thinking he's the worst communicator, you could say, my boss didn't communicate that to me, or didn't communicate it well, and he's really trying hard for his team to succeed. Or if you messed up, right, instead of me being a completely hopeless idiot or the perfect worker, you could say something like, I'm capable, intelligent enough to get the job done, but also I'm aware that I make mistakes too. Both of these can be true at the same time, right? Or if a loved one passed away, you could say something like, I feel so sad about the death of my father, and I'm also relieved that I don't have to be his caretaker anymore. Or it could be true that your wife could be insensitive towards you sometimes, and she also loves you too, right? So that's the skill of both, and you look for 2 or more parts of the situation. Okay, next, look for exceptions. Look for counterexamples. So if I have this thought, my wife never does the dishes, look for another way she contributes towards the household instead of focusing on something extreme. Or be specific about one single situation. Use a less extreme word instead of saying, my boss is a terrible communicator. You say, my boss wasn't clear about his expectations for the timeline of this assignment. Be really specific instead of saying everything is frustrating. Describe what specifically is frustrating and say, she didn't tell me the time frame. See, when we get specific, then we can actually do something about the problem. You could say something like, hey, next time, bosso, I need some more clarity on that deadline. If there's a communication problem at work, perhaps you need to work on clarifying statements or being more assertive. As much as we don't like to admit it, in the majority of situations, we are playing a role in the cycle. If there's a problem with chores in your marriage, we may need to consider how we're contributing or clarifying household tasks so we don't need to manage our stress levels better and not be so busy all the time. There's probably always something we can do to contribute to the solution. When we're able to be more flexible and intentional and truthful in our perceptions and our words, we're often able to escape these extreme emotions, and that anxiety and depression can be reduced. When it comes down to it, if you want it bad enough, you can change your brain and improve your mood, therefore making the relationships you have with the people around you better.